Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Sarah Podber. I'm the Prevention Director at the New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Thank you all for joining us today for today's workshop, Creative Interventions, Community-Based Transformative Justice Responses to Gender-Based Violence. What can your organization do? Facilitated by Mimi Kim, who we are very grateful to have with us today. This workshop is part of our Ending Violence Without Violence virtual training series, which developed from the conference of the same name that we were unable to hold last year due to the COVID pandemic. Our partners on that conference and in this series are the Seven Dancers Coalition and Interpreting Criminalization Research and Action Project. We will drop the link for the training series into the chat box so you can get more information if you want and check out what's coming up and what's been previously recorded. Before I introduce Mimi, I just have some quick logistic housekeeping to go over. This workshop is being recorded and we will send out the recording shortly after we were able to process it. ASL interpretation is available. The ASL interpreters video feeds will be spotlighted at the top of all our video feeds for everyone to see. English captioning is available to turn on the subtitles or view the live transcript. You can click on live transcript at the bottom of your screen and select either subtitles or full transcript. If you need any help with any of that or you have any other tech problems, please let us know in the chat. Chell Miller, NISCASA's communication director, is also here with us to help troubleshoot if anyone runs into any problems. So with that said, let me introduce Mimi. Mimi Kim is the founder of Creative Interventions and a co-founder of INCITE. She has been a longtime activist, advocate, and researcher challenging gender-based violence at its intersection with state violence and creating community accountability, transformative justice, and other community-based alternatives to criminalization. As a second-generation Korean American, she locates her political work in global solidarity with feminist anti-imperialist struggles, seeking not only to end oppression, but of the creation of liberation here and now. Mimi is also an associate professor.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Sorry, Deb, going too fast.
Very fast, and I'm not able to do interpretation.
So sorry with that, Deb.
Kim's background. Yeah. I'm sorry to interrupt.
We're also having an issue with the captions. Deb, let me just check in with you. Nope. Now the caption is appearing where it's supposed to. Thanks.
Great. Now the caption's up. I'll slow down, Marian. Thank you so much. Mimi is also an associate professor of social work at California State Long Beach. Her recent publications include The Carceral Creep, Gender-Based Violence, Race, and the Expansion of the Punitive State, and From Carceral Feminism to Transformative Justice, Women of Color Feminism, and Alternatives to Incarceration. Mimi, thank you again for being here with us and for your time on this, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I see there's a few people here. Since this is a workshop that's for NISCASA, I'm going to make the assumption that most of you, at least, are from some kind of provider organization or stakeholder in New York State. But since I saw this publicity going around to a wider network, there might be some other people who have joined us. You are all welcome. I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on the provider, sexual assault providers in this workshop. So if you're, I'm going to admit, when I saw the publicity for it, I didn't actually know it was for my workshop. I was like, oh, I wonder what they're going to say. That sounds interesting. And then I thought, oh, that's going to be me. So I know that when you say, what can your organization do? It makes, a lot of people like, give me the answer. And that's from so many different organizations that are struggling to figure out, struggling with conflict and harm, but also trying to figure out what does all this talk about transformative justice, how do we incorporate this into our lives, but into our organizations? I'm gonna, as a disclaimer, I'm gonna say that these are challenging questions. And I think what I'm gonna try to do is kind of lay out some of the context ultimately, and some pathways, but ultimately that is something that is going to be the further work that you do as a coalition, as we do as a community together. And I'm going to also give you some of my opinions based upon trying to answer this question about what do organizations do for the last few years. And, you know, it is challenging. And I think probably everybody on this webinar knows that transformative justice is both very appealing, but also there's not a straightforward path. A lot of this is around setting up new frameworks and ways of thinking, new cultures, some of which will resonate with us because those are the cultures that are part of our historical legacy. And so some of this is refining, revaluing those things, elevating them, making them real in our everyday lives. And some of this is discovering something that's new. This is a collective process. It's something that we're all in together, but each one of you, each one of us has our own particular role, and what we bring in because of our own personal experience, because of the experience of our people and our ancestors, if we are fortunate enough to be plugged into who that is. And I know for a lot of us, those are things that got cut off. Also, how do we live together now in 2021 and beyond, given like a vastly kind of different landscape than we may have had 2 years ago, but a landscape that is also very familiar, right? As we think that we're coming back to something that is normal, what was normal? So it's really bringing up a lot of these questions. And I'm just here for this 2 hours. You know, I had the great privilege to be here. I was at a NISCASA conference. I looked back and I saw it was 2017 when a few of us were talking about this at that time. And I don't know, I'm sure some of you were there and for some of you, you weren't there. I know that New York and other states have been having these conversations ongoing. I also know there's a lot of challenges and there's a certain amount of resistance. So I'm coming here with you, at least with my own experience of what that looks like, knowing that you have a wisdom about New York and your particular locations that I do not have, but I hope that what I can offer in this forum that's not super interactive, right? Not like I would have wanted if we were all sitting in a room together, but we are all getting very used to and accustomed to what we can do in Zoom. And I think over the practice of the last several months, we're a little bit better at it than we used to be. So I'm just happy it allows us to come together and for me to be here with people in New York, even though I'm sitting here in Los Angeles. I'm on Tongvan land, and I am looking at the Hollywood Hill, Hollywood sign from where I'm standing. So if you can have a little bit of a sense of where I am, a little different than probably where you all are in New York, but we are all coming together in one community for these 2 hours. And I know that we're in continued community with each other beyond. So please bear with me in doing the best I can to address what I thought would be the kinds of issues and perspectives that would be useful in this particular space. And thank you, Chell and Sarah, for speaking with me and, you know, for us to be able to share what that might be. I very much consider myself part of this movement, the anti-violence movement, the feminist anti-violence movement. I'm also very frustrated with this movement and have not been very quiet about that. And I believe that some of you feel similarly, and some of you may not. So some of you may be frustrated with people like me who are coming up and critiquing a movement that again, I feel a part of and that I feel like I have my great hopes and stakes in the kind of work that we have done and even more so the work that we can do in the future. So with that, greetings. We're going to take a little bit of a journey here, but I wanted to start with a poll, and poll number 1. And so I think we're all set up for polls. How familiar are you with the concept of transformative justice? I'm curious, and you're probably all curious about each other. And here we have very familiar, somewhat familiar, a little familiar, or not at all familiar. If you, all the polls are together. So I guess if you first can answer that one, I'll go to the next question. So if you can all answer number 1 as best as you can. And then we will go on to the next question because I think they're all in one poll. So I'm just assuming you're all doing that. It's totally anonymous, you all. So if you say not at all familiar, nobody will know. If you say very familiar, nobody's going to ask you, well, then why don't you explain something? Okay, so number 2, poll number 2. This is where, okay, if you're wondering why is there a skunk there, it's a polecat. It's a little play on words, all right? Just had to kind of entertain myself here. And I'm going to move that poll. How many of you have participated in what you believe was a transformative justice or community accountability process or an action? You know, maybe it wasn't a whole process. Maybe it was just something that you took part in that was like, this feels like transformative justice. This seems like community accountability. Yes, more than once. 2 is yes, one time. 3 is nope. And 4 is actually, I don't know. I'm not sure. So if you can go ahead and give your answers to poll number 2, please do. I'll give you a little minute there.
Thank you. I'm seeing that some folks are not able to access the poll. It could be your Zoom isn't quite up to date, or if you're on mobile or a tablet. I'm looking. I'm only seeing a couple of people who are not able to access it.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that, folks.
Yeah, I apologize. We've got about 73% of people who have voted.
Okay, not too bad. Okay, and we're going to go to, this is the last one. Poll number 3. Okay, another play on the word poll. How many of you have incorporated transformative justice into your sexual violence work at your agency? And I know there's a variation. I believe most of you this would make sense for, and there might be a few of you that are from a different kind of organization, but answer it nonetheless. Yes, this is very integrated. 2, somewhat integrated. 3, no, but we're starting or we're actively planning. 4, no, not yet. Or maybe just no. And the 5th one is no, never. And that could be like, I don't see my bosses ever doing it, or it might be, I don't feel like we should ever do that. So if you can respond to that one, this is the last of the questions. And again, apologies for those of you who can't participate. It's disappointing.
Yes, if you are able, you should have a window with the polls, and you should be able to submit when you scroll down and click submit. I've got 83% of folks have responded. Yeah.
Good.
80, and it's growing, so folks are submitting.
Okay.
Okay. All right, let's end the polling and let's see. And I am going to share the results. So you should be seeing a window with the results from all 3 polls.
Okay, great. So number 1, how familiar? Almost half of you, somewhat familiar. A good, what, 22%, very familiar. There's a few of you that this is new, so welcome. If we look at poll number 2, curious about this, 18% more than once. Okay, so we have almost 1 in 5 who have been part of more than one. And you know, if we're sitting there in a conference room, I definitely would call you out to ask about that. Please feel free to use the chat, although I'm going to just tell you that I'm not going to be looking very frequently at the chat because I can't multitask that much. Let's see. Yeah. So somebody, yes, that comes in pretty high. If you put those together, no is 32%. Let's let's see, let me move my poll. Not sure. That's a very reasonable response. 28% might have, but you're not sure. And the third, how many of you incorporated transformative justice into sexual violence work? I kind of figured if you were very integrated, I would have heard of you by now. And so I just threw that up there in case. Nice to say somewhat, see that somewhat is 17%. Actively planning, that's almost a quarter of you. And not yet, very understandable. I figured that's where most of you were. And no, never, I'm more curious to know why that is. If you want to put that in the chat, if you feel comfortable, you can, but I don't expect you to. So we have that. Now, I think these are always interesting for me to have just a sense, and hopefully for you to have a sense of where other people at least think that they are right now. So I'm just going to keep moving on. I just wanted us to get a sense of who's in the room and where we think we are on this question. So my agenda today, I was told that I had 2 hours, so then I maybe got a little overly ambitious, so we'll see. We're going to look at a little bit of roots. We're going to talk a little bit. I've had the opportunity to think about this historically, partly because I am a historical figure at this point, meaning I'm old. So I've been through, I entered the sexual assault work in the late 1980s. And so I've seen the trajectory. I was there when I wasn't part of VAWA getting passed. I mean, I wasn't working on VAWA, but I knew people that were, and I was part of that in 1994, part of the audience to that, and actually part of the very shocked and disappointed audience in 1994 because VAWA got passed as part of the crime bill. I did some historical research, so I just want to share a little bit about that with the Carceral Creep. Some of you might be familiar with that. But in reaching out to my colleagues and saying, what should I include? They said, please put that in, so I have. A little bit more about transformative justice, but I also know that you've had an opportunity to think about transformative justice, some of you, with Spring Up coming and perhaps the 2017 work and other work you've done. So I'm gonna not go full on into it.
Sorry, Mimi, we're not seeing the slides advance if you are moving them.
Oh, I am. This is what happened before. Why do you think that is?
You might have to stop the screen share and start over and select the PowerPoint window.
Okay, thanks for, I did this before and it was like I was on slide 10 before somebody told me.
We see the agenda now.
Oh my gosh, I have to go back and show you my cute poll things. Oh, they were so cute and kind of funny. Is there any way I can? Oh shoot, no. Folks. Oh, okay, I'm gonna just make you go through this, sorry. This was poll number 1. This was poll number 2, poll cat. This is poll number 3. Another variation of poll. Okay, so thanks for letting me know that all that searching Google images wasn't in vain. Here we're back to the agenda. Okay, and then finally, what must we do? And I'm just gonna be, I was like, can we, should we? I'm just gonna be imperative right now because I think that we all need to change. So it's not a great thing to just start by reading, but I'm gonna do this anyways, and bear with me. So this is something that I didn't write, but that I found in some writings. And I'm just gonna read it. As rape is given more publicity, more money and energy is spent prosecuting and convicting rapists, how is this after the fact action helping us as women? And I understand this was using the gender binary of women with assumptions about probably cisgendered women. So, you know, we can expand ourselves to think of we as people, we can think we as inclusive of gender non-conforming people, transgender people. So just want to give that caveat. The rape rate appears to be increasing. In fact, if all men, again, excuse the gender binary, who had ever raped were incarcerated tomorrow, rape would continue outside as well as inside prisons. Incarceration does not change the societal attitudes which promote rape. In a society that deals with symptoms rather than causes of problems, prisons make perfect sense. Confronting the causes of rape would threaten the basic structure of society. By actively encouraging women to prosecute a rape, we are helping to reinforce the legitimacy of the criminal justice system. This system convicts primarily poor and non-white men for a crime that we know is universally committed by men. Again, excuse the gender binary. In New York and Washington, D.C., of the few rapists who are convicted, most are on the streets again within 2 years. Plus, it takes at least 6 months to get a conviction. But most important, prison is vindictive. It is not concerned with change, but with punishment. And its real social function is similar to that of rape. It acts as a buffer, as an oppressive institution where a few scapegoats pay for the ills of society. Whenever this issue is raised, it is often dismissed because there are no existing alternatives to the criminal justice system. This is a valid problem, but rather than resigning ourselves to it, we should begin to actively seek alternatives. We propose this not because we're soft on rapists, but because of our own long-range self-interest as women. Concern over what happens to a rapist once convicted can be viewed in 2 ways. First, we can view it as women still trapped by our other-directed or selfless socialization, or we can view it as a logical outgrowth of our politics. So, when do you think this was written? I'm asking that question, and people could put out in the chat what you think. Let me see if I can read the chat. Oh, I don't see any guesses. Oh, I see some. Okay, yeah, this was written in 1974. So this is one this was an early newsletter at the very early years of the more organized second wave feminist anti-rape movement, 1974. And when I was looking at this, I mean, I have to say, I don't know what you think, and a lot of people guess that this was old, but are these not some of the things we're saying today in 2021 or in 2015? You know, a little different language, but I think I was struck by the analysis, by the search for alternatives at that time, even though talking about alternatives, by the resistance that people knew that they might face in talking about alternatives that might be around also compassion for people who have raped, who are rapists. So I just want to, I thought I'd introduce this just to be like, this is something that our movement has been grappling with since the beginning, but it actually, this kind of analysis has been silenced for many, many years. And part of that is going to be what I'm going to introduce next in some of my historical analysis that I've done. This is all available on the web if you look it up, this Feminist Alliance Against Rape. And you know, it's interesting to look at some of the early work. Some of you might, sitting here, might even have been a part of this, I'm not sure, but I found it very interesting. So I want to get a little bit into then how did we get here from a beginning of a movement that was much more potentially radical, and that really already saw what the problems would be in joining forces with prosecutors and law enforcement. I believe that voice got increasingly muffled over time. How did that happen? So I was really interested in this as I did some research, and I came in the late 80s, so I know that was a long time ago, but also in some ways criminalization was a little bit of a done deal. I started my work in a rape crisis center in Chicago. So we weren't super carceral, but we did, I think, consider working with law enforcement to be part of our job. And some of that was just mitigating the harm of law enforcement. But I really had this question of how is it that a liberatory movement, a feminist movement, chose criminalization as a dominant strategy? It's such a done deal now that you might think, of course we did. There's carceral feminism, but we didn't even have the term carceral feminism for a while. So I became more curious, you know, understanding that there were more radical roots, and, you know, trying to figure out how it is that we got here. And the other thing was, the question I had was thinking about, at that time, like, the movement was heady. It was like, wow, we're making bills. We're having things, you know, in the 1970s. And I mostly concentrated on the battered women's movement, or the anti-domestic violence movement. But we had a time when the cops, they don't really actually care about gender-based violence at all. It's like, just keep that away from us. Or just let us commit it at home and don't make it a crime at home and on the streets. So how is it that this success that we felt that we had as a movement actually led to feeling subordinated? And I have to ask people, anybody who's getting funded by the Office of Violence Against Women, that was seen as some kind of like a victory. But how much, you know, like, we won, yay. But how many of us feel really like we're on top of and controlling OVW now? Or how many of you actually feel like they're controlling us? So we are in a different moment for sure. So I hope this makes sense to people. I was thinking a little bit about, if we look at our movements and some of our work, and we might have people here that are part of government, law enforcement, I don't know. But generally speaking, I think we still could think about our movements as really being not in government, but we're really placed in what we call civil society, or not in the government, not in businesses, but actually with communities, with the people. And then there's the government, or the state. So if we look at those two relationships, we think of social movements in one, we think of social movements as making demands to the other, the target of social movements, which is oftentimes part of the government or part of the state. And what I did is I looked at the formation of two different institutions, which should be also familiar to you in the sexual assault world. I know we're very, very siloed, domestic violence, sexual assault, but I believe that domestic violence and sexual assault advocates are involved in victim witness programs that are throughout prosecutor offices in the United States, very familiar. The other is the community coordinated response. We call it the CCR in the domestic violence world, but I think it's what's called now a SART, or has been for a long time in the sexual assault world, right? Sexual assault response teams. So given that in the 70s, at least, we had a situation in which we were really just discovering kind of this language of, and the pervasiveness of gender-based violence, many of our institutions actually didn't even want us to be part of them. So there was something that was going on at that time. And I looked at these two institutions that started in that both started in 1980. Victim witness program started in San Francisco as a response by advocates to say, listen, the police aren't paying any attention to us. The prosecutors aren't paying any attention to us. So we're going to use a strategy to try to get them to pay attention. And that is, we're going to embed ourselves within the Hall of Justice. We're going to start a victim witness program. So these were sort of starting around the country, but they hadn't been used at that time with gender-based violence. It was just, so it was in some ways an innovation in our social movement to say, well, we're going to use this for survivors of sexual violence and survivors of domestic violence. So San Francisco was where there was a start to do this, and really the start with the intention of building kind of a model program. On the right hand, you had what, I don't know if people are familiar with Ellen Pence and the work of Duluth and the Duluth Project, but this was the birth of the community coordinated response. And it was a way that Ellen Pence and others thought, listen, police aren't doing anything for us. So we are going to create something that is a way that we're going to relate to each other, advocates and law enforcement. And we're going to do that by having some combined intersection and interaction where we're going to share agendas, we're going to share strategies, we're going to come to common meetings, but what we're going to do is drive them to do something for our survivors of violence. And that's not what they're doing right now. So this is our institutional response. Let's start something and we'll call it the CCR. When I did these interviews with people who had started these institutions, I saw this kind of refrain coming up, which is, we had a feminist agenda and they didn't really even know about it. They didn't even know. They didn't, in some ways, kind of walked into our trap. We were the ones that were in control. Trap, they didn't use that word necessarily, but if you look at the victim witness program, people said we were like infiltrating. And they actually had people from the outside that were making demands, and the police and the prosecutors returned to the people that were part of the victim witness program, like, what should we do? And like, oh, we'll help you out. Meanwhile, having, you know, being very much the same people as the outside agitators. And then so they had an inside infiltration strategy, if that makes sense. There was a different kind of strategy with the community coordinated response. And that was this understanding that if feminist organizations and advocates get together with law enforcement's going to always have the upper hand. Now, keep that in mind. Now, I don't know if anybody else hasn't found that to be true. They will ultimately have the upper hand. So we need to also institutionalize something to make sure that we can keep control. And they developed an oversight organization called the Domestic Abuse Intervention Project, which still exists in Duluth today, that controlled the way that agendas were set the agendas, and were a way that feminists could control what looks like a collaborative set of relationships, and left on its own would have been controlled by law enforcement. So how is it that they developed this institution with that very much in mind, that they would institutionalize feminist control? So I hope you're with me here. But what happened? Both of these became model programs. I think that Victim Witness very intentionally had been a model program. Community Coordinated Response became very like Donahue's show, and people remember that. A lot of TV, stage channels were going over to Duluth to figure out what they were doing that was so interesting to them. They became model programs that then became replicated. But what happens when you replicate a program that has a subversive feminist control element to it? Does that get written down in the manual? Make sure you're infiltrating. Make sure you have this. I think they did try to write in some manuals for the CCR, but as they got replicated, it lost that element of feminist control. It was very susceptible to being lost. And over time, what happened? You developed these new institutions, the Victim Witness Program and the CCR or the SART, in which you as an advocate may have come in and said, I'm going to be playing this role in which I'm resisting police control and making sure that they do what I want. But you found yourself almost being like an agent of a law enforcement agency. I don't know if anybody has had that experience, but it became a little bit difficult to tell, am I on the outside or am I actually part of them? This collaborative institution created relationships that became institutionalized to be collaborative, to be kind of blended with each other. And that's why I recognize that these became hybrid spaces. And if we want to look at Family Justice Center today, we actually have a state, often state-led prosecutorial agency, right? I know I was in Oakland and they didn't even talk to any of the advocates about starting the FJC. It was started by the DA's office. And some of you might have very similar experiences. I know I've talked to many who have. So what did they do? They started a one-stop shop where we're pulled into their one-stop shop and even under the same roof as them. And over time, how could we see that our power and our autonomy has become reduced as we become part of those FJCs? And we can have a whole, 2-hour discussion, 2-week discussion on this. So you might all have different experiences and opinions, but this has happened in many places. So how do we look at this as a process? We can say that, and how do we answer these questions about how is it that feminists who really had feminist demands became in such close relationship with law enforcement. And this is part of the story I was trying to really understand for myself. And how is it that we might have great wins at the beginning, but over time, we became increasingly controlled by those who we thought we had something over when we were first making those wins. So if we think about this, at first we were starting with contestation, we didn't have a relationship with police for the most part. They didn't want to have a relationship with feminist advocates or social movement people. But we started being crafty and we ourselves started organizations and institutions that invited this collaboration, but then said, hey, we're going to be smart about this. And we actually have feminist control. And that's like the little women's sign that's floating above, with the police not even knowing what hit them. That started disappearing over time with replication, right? As we got more and more of these programs started, where they started even by feminists, where they started by law enforcement. I heard that people said the judges were starting these institutions, prosecutors were starting them. Maybe they'd hire somebody, or they'd have some kind of collaborative relationship with an advocacy group. Sometimes they didn't even have one. They just hired their own people. How is it that we had more and more of these kinds of organizations and institutional relationships where we lost who we were, we lost our autonomy, we lost our independence, we became more blended as agents of the police? How did these institutions grow and grow as these models replicated? And actually, if we look at OVW, at least for domestic violence, a lot of times your RFP has to say how you are actually collaborating with law enforcement in order for you to even get that grant. And how is it over time that we have become subordinated to those very institutions and police presence that we thought we were winning over at the earlier part of the movement? So if we call this process a dance, we might call it a carceral creep. And I have now referred to this, and I'm looking for this even all the time today, even in the work that I do myself. How much am I engaging in this kind of delusion that I have control over a process that actually is part of a carceral creep? Something that we're going to put all our energy into looking at reforms, relationships, and so on, trainings, and turning our energies away from the communities and the people that we're most accountable to. That is the overarching question and the context that I bring in talking about this work on transformative justice. Okay. I hope that all made some sense to you. I know, like, this is not a very interactive forum. Yeah, people are like, oh, yeah, so New York had a devastating experience with FJCs. Absolutely. So I hope that made sense. I'm going to move on. I wish we could have a discussion on this, but I'm going to move forward. So another way of looking at this, and the way that I came to this question, is thinking about what do survivors want, which is, and I'm going to use the example of domestic violence. I know this is sexual assault organization, but I think you'll understand some of the parallels here. So if we look at domestic violence, what do survivors want? Are they saying, oh, please, I want to escape to a shelter? They might be calling us for a shelter bed, but is that really what they wanted? Did they say, yes, please arrest the abuser, arrest my partner? Yes, some people do say that, but is that really what they want as an ultimate option? Yes, many people leave a relationship and feel like there's their only choice. But I also want to ask the question, how many survivors actually would prefer to stay safe at home? How many survivors have said, I want to stay in this relationship, but I want the violence to stop? How many people have said, I want a solution in which I can keep my home and community intact? I don't have to run away. And I'm looking at, I worked for years, and I still do, with immigrant communities where survivors can't just up and leave. Sometimes they depend on that intimate immigrant community for all their needs, their emotional needs, their material needs. And so just to think that you could just leave and go somewhere else is not realistic. And I know that's not only true for immigrant communities, that's true for so many of us. So then why is it that we've spent all our past years focusing in on how to do this better, how to make better shelters, how to make better arrest policies and stronger arrest policies, how to have safety plans that are all around leaving, not anything around staying safe and staying? And why is it that when we ask, what have we done and what do we have available for people on the right-hand side to stay safe at home, to stop the violence, or at least reduce the violence to a point that you feel that you can live with? And I know people have problems with me saying that, but I think that's what some people want. How do we keep homes and communities intact? Why is it that even now there's more answers, because transformative justice has been trying to answer that, but so many of us in our provider organizations are still like, I don't know, is that possible? Don't tell me, it's too dangerous, and so on. We've done so little, we've invested so little bit of our imagination, we've invested so little time and energy, and certainly almost no money compared to the billions spent on law enforcement, billions on law enforcement. So why is that? And the question that I have is, what do we want as a movement? And if we want something different, then what's stopping us? And I just continue to ask this question. If we have, and I feel like many people made a forward movement and then just stop, like, I don't know how to do that, we can't do that, and reeled back. I don't know where you all are in New York, but being in California, I've seen that reeled back. And so I'm asking us continuously, and I'm asking you now today, what is stopping us from moving forward? And how do we remove those barriers? What do sexual assault survivors want? Do they want to call the police? You know that a lot of people don't want to do that. Do they want to jail the rapist? Some people, but many people, that's not what they want. Do they want to go to individual therapy? I mean, most of us want therapy. We don't necessarily want to pay the money that we have to pay for individual therapy. But those are, and you in New York may have developed differently, but I think that those are still many of the models that, the standards that we have. And I, ask you, and if we had more time, we'll like ask us to break out. If you want to actually use the chat to say, what is it that survivors have been saying that they want that is not this? And if people want to like just throw out some responses to share with each other, that would be great. I'm gonna look. You're being quiet. You're being chat quiet. Thank you. Prevent violence, healing, absolutely. Hey, Kiyomi. For the violence to stop. Yep. Okay, great. Safety, acknowledgement of harm, absolutely. Community support, yes. Accountability, apology, what does accountability look like? Healing, validation, absolutely. To have this not happen again, absolutely, and not to anybody. Want to know if it's genetic, biological, for them to seek their own support and healing, great. Permanent change, deep and permanent change. And as we heard, does arrest lead to deep and permanent change? Does it lead to a more peaceful and less rape in our world? No, not at all. They knew that in 1974. Great, thank you so much for sharing all these. Absolutely, economic security, yes. Thank you, Nancy. Good to see. I mean, I know many of you are new to me, but I have a couple of friends here. Thank you so much. So these are, the conversation I know you're having, but we have to continue to have. We've been so narrow and narrowly focused on enhancing penalties, having more laws, making sure there's police response. You know this. we have, and at the same time, I know a lot of sexual assault organizations do have a policy and, you know, a deep value around not promoting a police response and not saying that you need to, you know, in order to really do what you need to do, that you would try to go to the criminal legal system. I know that that's true of sexual assault centers, and many of you are doing many things that are and have been alternative. Thank you so much for those responses. So I'm just going to go to one of my stories to share. Some of you may have heard this before, and if you've seen the toolkits also in that story, because I'm just going to talk, this is something like in the early years when I first was starting creative interventions, which is around 2004. Okay, that's many, many years ago now. But, and I remember I was working closely, very, very closely and intimately with a community-based organization that was for survivors, immigrant survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. And, you know, we were talking about what does a creative intervention look like? What does community accountability look like? We didn't, transformative justice was around as a term then, but I didn't use it very much because I felt like moving away from the word justice at the time. Still kind of have feelings about that. But I do use the word transformative justice now, or the term. So this story is about somebody who came to one of our agencies, and she had just, there was, she worked at a bar as a bartender, and she was at one of the parties that they had, and her boss, who owned the bar, attempted to rape her. She came to our organization, and this is not creative interventions, this is like a more standard domestic violence and sexual assault organization, and said, okay, this is what I want to do. I want to confront him. So first of all, I want to ask you, and you might be different places at this now, like ask yourself, how would you have responded? I know that there's still got to be a lot of organizations to be like, well, that's great, but that's dangerous. I have no idea how I was going to support you with that. In fact, if you feel like you would be able to respond to her by supporting her, you know, maybe put that in the chat, because that would be something that's, I know there's many, many different types of responses we have, but the standard one at that time, and I think still now, is we're not going to support that. We understand your feeling about that, but we're not going to support that. And so I remember being in like a case review, and we were talking about this, and we were starting to talk about creative interventions and really what do we want to do that's different. And this advocate was like, I'm going to go with her. I'm going to go to the bar. She asked me, I'm going to go. We're going to confront her. I'm like, wait a minute here. And this is where we started kind of developing the kinds of questions that we ended up asking at Creative Interventions when we held that as a pilot project. But really asking more about what is it that you want? What do you want to gain? And also talking through what is our role. Now, it's different if you were we weren't her friend, we were advocates that she turned to. And so, you know, I said, probably not a good idea to go there. First of all, think about safety. So the questions were, so the next meeting was to talk about safety and to ask a lot of questions around, what do you think he would say? What would happen if you walk in to the bar and he has a gun, which a lot of people own bars have? What if he, you know, and all of these what ifs that she hadn't thought of. So I saw that as part of our role. It was really being somebody to ask questions, to do role plays. She could have been like, oh, she did say I didn't think of that, but she may have been, I didn't think of that, I'm not going to do it now. I'll come up with something else. What she did was she still said, I still want to do this, but I can see that it might not be a good idea to go into the bar. So what I'm going to do is to call him and ask him to meet me somewhere else. So then it's safety planning. Where could you do this? Where in case something went down, you'd have some safety and protection. And we started asking the question, who else could go with you? Who can be there? And she said, I don't have anybody. I don't have any, just like as many immigrants, she's felt like I don't have anybody that would do that with me. So again, we started asking questions right away about who do you have in your community who might back you up on this, not to expose themselves to danger that they don't want to take somebody by surprise, but really thinks through a supportive role that they can play. Because for her, she knew that she personally wanted to do that confrontation. So she had planned this out with the support of the advocate, felt like very much that she had a sounding board and somebody to talk to about it. And she went ahead and called him. He agreed that he was going to meet her in a public place. So she goes to a public place. She actually does have a friend who's going to support her by being there with a cell phone, not far away. So just in asking the question, at first she said, I don't have anybody. And as she was planning this and sort of had that orientation, started thinking about who else could play a role. She also went there and talked to the server and said, listen, I'm going to have a conversation at that table with somebody. Can you please keep a lookout? And if anything looks, and I think she probably did, come in and intervene. Maybe she said, call the police. I can't remember. But can you just keep an eye? And she must have had an eye for a server that she thought would be willing to do that. And the server said, yes, I'll do that. And was kind of keeping an eye to make sure that things were safe. So see how she didn't even have people in mind, but being oriented towards that, she was able to mobilize people to actually provide safety and support for her, even at that moment. So, what happened was she came back, we weren't there, she came back and reported and said, I went there, I talked to him, I told him my experience, and he admitted it, and he apologized. Now, we don't know if, he was a changed person after that. We don't know if he got craftier. We don't know, but we know that how she felt afterwards. And that is, she felt empowered. She was able to do the thing that she wanted to do. And with all of the kind of safety questions and so on, still decided that that was something she wanted to follow, but was so much more prepared. She brought in people to support her as part of her safety team. And she was able to confront this person and get some of those things that you said. Is that full accountability? I don't know. I'm not going to blow this up into being like this perfect story, but I think that you can see that the kinds of things that she gained from moving forward, having us as advocates to support her in that, may have resulted in a different kind of feeling, a different, maybe even kind of healing than she would have had if she went with our standard response, which is don't do that, come to us for counseling. Have you thought of calling the police? I mean, we did ask that and she didn't want to call the police, and so on. So that's my, what does this look like? It wasn't a huge process. It wasn't all teams building up, because if you are familiar with some of the TJ work, sometimes we do that. But it was that in kind of a smaller scale, and it was a scale that worked for her. So I just want to put that out as my story number one, just to pique your imagination a little bit and see that we're not necessarily talking about something that's going to take huge amounts of training and we have to all these institutional things in place. Sometimes it's just using the people you have around you in a different orientation around being collective, being responsive, asking somebody what they want, and kind of exploring that. That's a huge part of what TJ work is. It's a huge part of what we sort of developed in our ridiculously long 600-page manual. That's my kind of first story introduction into our work. I just want to look a little bit. Oh, people are like, yeah, does everything have to be a huge accountability process? I'm hearing you, I'm feeling you. Okay, so we're gonna move, and I wish I could see all those. Somebody save that chat because I'm gonna look through it later on.
Will do.
Thank you. Okay, so a little bit about transformative justice. Now this is, for some of you, I know the 6% were like, it's really new to me. This is not a transformative justice training, and there's so much more to say, and there's people in this audience here who give this training. Kiyomi, thank you for being here. Kiyomi's been doing this work a lot, along with a lot of other people in our communities. So what is transformative justice? A lot of different kinds of, you know, I think we're not into having a dictionary of transformative justice and words, but basically I think what we see more, I know when I started, I thought of it more as like, I was very interested in the sort of mechanics. How do we do this? I think where we're at right now in the kind of the flourishing world that we've created around abolition and transformative justice is really understanding this as a framework, as a philosophy, as a way of life for building the liberated world we want. Not like in the future, 50 years from now, or, you know, many of us don't have 50 years from now, but whatever future, but what we're building right now today, that is going to be the foundation, and that has been the foundation for the liberated world we want. It's a way or method, you know, if you look more narrowly, of dealing with conflict, violence, abuse, harm, without creating more harm. And what that means, without creating more harm, is without calling the police, which does create more harm, without resorting to jails and prisons, which is a system that causes harm, deeply causes harm, and organizes so much of our world in a way that criminalizes certain people, people of color, BIPOC people, makes people expendable, LGBTQIA people, two-spirit people, poor people, immigrants, undocumented, people with disabilities. Look at people with mental illness and how they are routinely have a 16-time more chance of being killed by the police than somebody without a mental illness. This is a system that kills. So how do we have a method that does not create more harm? How do we understand violence, not as just between two people? And I know that many of you have gone beyond this right now, but as rooted in conditions of poverty, racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, and, you know, with white supremacy, colonization, capitalism, there's so many terms that get thrown out, but they actually have meaning. And I know sometimes they just look like a list of words. How do we make that actually have meaning? How do we use then not systems of punishment, not systems of revenge, even though we understand that sometimes I can feel like I want that. Any one of us can. But how do we actually turn to a bigger vision of ourselves as a community in our future by using collective care, compassion, connection to create change, and not the police, not the child welfare system. I was part of a group that put on a really great webinar last night, Haymarket Books, about social work and the family regulation system. I really urge you to look at it, watch it. It's their record is really, really, really well done. It's really informative. Or other systems of violence, and also not revenge and vigilante violence. Okay, what is trans? So those are, obviously there's so much more to be said, but those are some basics. What is it? It's collective and community based. We're talking about mobilizing friends, family, and community, and you could hear some of that in that story, even for somebody who didn't have very much community here. The possibility of dealing with a person who's caused harm. Well, she certainly did deal with that person, not to arrest him, not to put him in jail, maybe to shame him. And yet she did him a service also by sitting there and doing truth telling with him. Again, we don't know how he changed or if he did, but there was that dynamic there and that possibility. How do we things that are non-professionalized? I know a lot of us be like, oh, hire an expert on transformative justice. We're all experts. That's what we're asking. That 600-page toolkit was created in part because it was like, give you all tools. For those of you who have friends and family, you yourselves are in a situation of violence. You all have wise people around you. You sometimes are that wise person. How is it that we equip each other to do these kinds of interventions to violence and prevention? How do we do this and consider this our work as a human being, our political work, or just what we would do to be a good neighbor, to be a good relative, and not with law enforcement. And sadly, I have to say rarely with services, in part because services have not gotten away from the kinds of standards of working in a very regulated, professionalized way, and with law enforcement, enough to have like a huge amount of hope to say, please go to your sexual assault rape crisis center in your town, because they will surely help you with transformative justice. That is not the case. Will it be in the future? We consider this holistic, and we, holistic can be so many things, but that's a term that we use to really understand that this was about centering and supporting survivors. That's what probably most of you on this call, on the Zoom call, at least say you do. Do we always do that? Sometimes we're advocate oriented. We give the menu that we have, and if somebody wants something different, we don't have it. But how do we center survivors? How do we go to communities and transform communities to see themselves as the places that, yes, cause harm? They do. They have to set the context for harm, but also are part of the solution. And how is it that we move to embrace those who actually have caused harm, or to connect with care and compassion? And some of us might be in a situation like, I can't do that. That is not me. I'm not going to get there. But how do we create a framework in which we have people that can and will, without getting caught into something that seems obligatory or like an unhealthy relationship, but a healthy relationship based upon our concern for the greater good? And I think that we have, little by little, more and more people stepping up to that challenge. How do we engage with people who have done harm so they actually become part of the solution? How do we have systems, responses, our own system responses, such that people might think that it's actually in their interest to take accountability, and it wouldn't be just something that was going to lead to their incarceration or their complete banning from community, and that's a real thing right now. So if we step back a little bit, we're looking at a crisis of over-reliance on criminalization. That's a kind of most mild way of saying what we have right now, and very vastly underdeveloped communities response. And we have been part of that. We have been part of creating this as an individualized and criminal justice response to sexual violence. Who are our first responders after all? And I think we know this. Family, friends, community members are generally the ones we first turn to. Why are we not creating responses then that equip people who are the first responders to actually do something's an effective job? Why are we focusing on our service centers only and on having a better improved law enforcement response? I'm not saying that none of you are doing this, some of you are, but not very many. Just bottom line questions: how do we strengthen community-based responses, whether we call it transformative justice or community accountability? And how do we increase the community's capacity, not just our own, but the community's capacity, those who are at the grassroots level, to respond effectively to domestic and sexual violence, and to be creating the world that we want to see? So I'm going to move on a little bit and then get into what we did, creative interventions. I think I gave some hints with this, my story number one. But it's been a while now, but we've continued to support transformative justice and community accountability, through making tools available, through having stories available. Why? Not so that we could be the experts. Please call us, we're going to tell you what to do, but so you all can be experts. So we can all understand ourselves as people that need to take action, but in a different way than we've really been training ourselves to do over these last now 40 years. This is Beth Ritchie's quote that we sort of adopted as our tagline early on. This is not about ending violence. How many of us have a mission that's about ending violence? This is about something bigger than ending violence. If we only have our vision of ending violence, we're going to have these kind of short-term safety, call the cops, have immediate safety from the person who's caused harm. We're not talking about ways in which we're creating safety through liberation. And if we have our vision more long-term and based upon liberation, it's going to give us a different orientation towards what our work is and our responses can be. So just imagine that for a second. How much are we just focusing in on ending violence in the short term? How much do we need to look at redefining people, everybody's hearing this, redefining community safety and looking at the greater good, things like, and people said that in the chat, not only ending violence, but looking at safety through housing, through education, through investment in parks, through investment in healthcare and mental health care. How is it that we can do that? And how much would that reduce the rates of rape? So when we started, and we still look at this today, because I think that this is a little different than when we started, but it's not different enough, that we really looked at trying to shift towards having these expanded options available. And again, looking at domestic violence, but also this is around sexual violence as well. We really internalized this holistic model. And even for the many times when we were just dealing with a survivor and not dealing with the person who caused harm, we would actually orient ourselves different. I think before, when I worked at a shelter, if somebody started talking about the person who caused harm with any kind of care, it was like red flag, red flag. You should care about yourself. It's time for you to take care of yourself. Don't think about them. I don't know how many of you still do this, right? But in fact, we go to reorient ourselves, that could be seen as something that's of value of that person and not denigrated as something that's pathological and anti-feminist. But somebody cares about somebody. Somebody cares that they become a better person. Somebody cares that they not go to prison. That was something that I trained other people to do, and I was trained to think of that as pathological and against your liberation. But what was it to shift that and think, even if we're not going to meet with that person, how do we have an orientation towards this that is actually embracing of a bigger vision of who can be transformed and who is part of our community ultimately? That's a hard one for people to take. It doesn't mean we don't have rage, we aren't disgusted, that we might even wish violence. Do I wish violence on people? Yes, I do. I mean, we have that reaction, we have that human reaction. And now how do we step away and say, but if we have the liberated world we want, how do we transcend that? How do we collectively come together and not only have a framework, but actual practice and way of life that moves beyond that kind of binary? That's a big question. One of the first things we did was we started collecting stories because we were just getting started. We didn't have a toolkit then, y'all. We had no toolkit. It was like, what are we going to do? We had some values. A lot of us came with our sexual assault and domestic violence experience personally, but also as workers. We brought in people who had caused harm, who actually were working with people who had caused harm into our collective pool. And but we also asked a bunch of questions in the community because people in the community started saying, oh, are you talking about when such and such happened? Are you talking about when a group of young people actually found out their friend was getting beaten by their father and they went and confronted the father? Oh my God, yes, I think that is what we're talking about. I wonder what they did. I wonder how that girl felt about what they did. I wonder if that father changed. This became these are the kinds of questions that oriented us towards the storytelling project and thinking about how do we get these stories to actually inform us about what people have been doing to stop violence collectively. What have they seen as successful? Because these stories weren't considered stories. They weren't even considered as like, people were like, do you mean this story? This is an important story? Yes, that is an important story. That's a story that wasn't even considered violence intervention. But this is what we're trying to center. And I know that of all the, the dozens of people out there right now, that there are several of you who have a story to tell about what you did, or I mean, you're wondering about. By the way, we're kicking up this project again, storytelling and organizing project. So let me know. You can email me if you have a story that you think you want to share. So we really looked, and we took these values very seriously. How are we going to do something that's community-based? It's not based in our office, and we did have an office. It's based in the community in which violence happens. How is it that we're going to be collectively oriented, but look towards people not mobilizing just like, my aunt said this, my brother said something totally different, but how are we going to actually support people to be more collective and organized in that response? How are we going to ask open-ended questions instead of the question of, well, do you want to see a lawyer? Are you going to go to the police? Do you need help with translation? Having the menu. How are we going to actually ask, what is it that you want? And let's help you think about what's possible. How is it that we're going to think about who you can bring in together, like I told in that story? How is this going to be holistic? How might this actually engage the person who caused harm? How are we going to be comfortable with taking risks? Not to say, oh, don't do that, it's going to be too dangerous. But these are some of the dangers. What do you think about them? What are some ways to reduce that danger? Is it still something that you want to do because you'd rather do that than just leave or stay in a relationship or do nothing, or just do things in our way? Because what we've been doing is saying we don't want to take risks, but put somebody else in the place of taking risks because we're not even supporting them to do something more safely. And so this is the kind of continuous set of questions that we asked us. Is it these things? And how do we have an approach and a framework and a practice that supports all of these? We also were a facilitated model. We consider ourselves facilitators, not interveners. We didn't, I think the first story I said, she did ask, hey, advocate, can you come with me? It's like, yes, I'll go. That was her immediate response. Pulling back and saying, and that's different if you're their friend or you're their family member, you might go. But if we are in a facilitator position, then we might pull back and be the one asking questions. And we saw this as the way we worked. We met with anybody motivated to intervene. So it didn't have to be the survivor. It might have been the sister, the brother, the uncle, the friend. And that's not something that we usually do in our service agencies. We encourage a collective response. We sort of serve as an anchor to ask questions so that somebody could kind of clear their mind and figure out what it is that was possible and what do they actually wanted. We asked a lot of questions. We helped to map things out. We provided a space at that time. We gave the energy of our facilitation. I know we had a big whiteboard and people would start, I might start writing for them, like what was coming from them. They might go up to the whiteboard and start writing, and then we take pictures of that whiteboard. We offered those types of resources. And mostly we were a sounding board. And as I said, we did a lot of role playing and sometimes helped to document where they were in their process. So this is the work that we did. And the idea was anybody can be a facilitator. It doesn't have to be creative interventions, doesn't have to be so-and-so expert who wrote a book on such and such. It could be anybody. It can be you. It can be somebody who doesn't even know what transformative justice is, but just has that kind of innate way of dealing with crisis. Let's support them. We made a giant toolkit. I'm going to show you. Actually, we just, this, this is available. I shouldn't even, this is almost a tease, y'all, because we made this available on Blue Stockings, but we're having problems with the printer. So AK Press is going to, I think, come out with this in the summer. And we're making it as cheap as possible. We're not making a penny of profit on it. Just to let you know. Still might be kind of expensive because it's color and it's 600 pages long. They're saying $40, so yeah, and you can get it. The PDF is free, and so it's just a lot of paper if you're going to print it out. We call it lovingly the tool shed, and these are the components of the model. And I don't know, this again could be, weeks. You ordered. Will it work, or should I cancel the order? Oh, if you ordered it recently and you didn't get anything yet, I'd cancel it and wait for AK Press. I'm an AK Press member. Oh, great. Okay. Oh, okay. I stopped looking at the chat, but really nice that you're out there. So the toolkit's absolutely available on our website for free. So this is not just, it was only recently that we even had the option of having a paperback copy. So it's still there. People have been downloading that or just using it for all of these years. And so we have these, and I'm going to kind of work, use that other example I gave, like getting clear. So the first step, instead of saying what's an assessment, getting clear, what happened? What's going on? Who's getting hurt? How long has this been happening? The kinds of questions I think many of us are used to asking. But how is it that we can support somebody better by being clear? But how is it that in them responding that they get clear about what's going on? Because any one of us knows if we're in crisis, everything gets jumbled and it's very hard to think clearly about what you're even facing. How could you just get together with another person? And, if you need the help of a toolkit, go ahead. That might help you to think about some questions, or maybe I'm in crisis, but I need a little bit of guide to help me through this. So getting clear, staying safe. Of course, safety is still very, very critical. The thing is, we're not talking about, we might see it once people start mobilizing, and I think we all know this, that can actually create increased risks of harm. So how do you take those into account? How do you have a safety plan? Told you this, my first story of the different things that we talked this woman through in order to prepare her to take as many precautions as she could. Now, she could have just decided not to do it at all, which would have been in some ways safer, right? But she wanted to take a risk, and she appreciated the help to think about how to do it safely or more safely. Mapping allies, who's there, who can help you? And it might not even be your best friend, because maybe they're great to go, hang out with, but they're terrible in helping you through a crisis. So who is it that can help you through this particular crisis? Who have you thought of? Who haven't you thought of? And so a lot of what we did is just to support people and give them the space to think about it. I had people that came in and I was like, why don't you call them right now? I'm like, okay. And I just sit there while they called 5 people to help them move that weekend, which they needed. These are different ways that you can do things from your very office. How do we support survivors? It was necessary to do this because I think those of us that have been involved in processes around transformative justice know that it's possible to get so engaged with a person who caused harm, they almost forget about the survivor. And so just how is it that we can support survivors? How can we support survivors in a way in which they're leading the process, or maybe that they want to take more of a backseat role and have other people to take a more active role while they maybe just are informed of what's happening. There's so many different situations. And part of looking through that part of the toolkit is to think through what some of the different situations are. Goal setting. What is it that you hope to achieve? I mean, everybody wants violence to get better or healing to happen, but how does that happen? Do you have the same goals ultimately? And this is a hard one, I think, for people working collectively, in part because we're an individualistic society. So we don't always think about goals as negotiated and free to think about, but that's very much part of this, a very important part of our transformative justice work. How do we support people to take accountability? This is really, really hard. And I don't think I have the image here, but we came up with a staircase, what we now call a pathway to accountability. Understanding that people do not come to accountability readily. None of us do. I mean, we may not have personally created some of the harms that we encounter in our work. Maybe some of us have. I'm not going to make that as a presumption. But all of us want to kind of sneak away or just be, cut me a little bit of slack. If we've been confronted with something we need to be accountable for, we cannot expect people to say, oh, you're calling me to be accountable. Great, I'm perfectly accountable. I'm going to do everything that you're asking me to do. People come to it with resistance. In the future, if we have cultures that are more, where there's more expectation, that people will be handled with compassion and care, when we understand what it means to be accountable and make that a daily part of our lives, we won't meet the kind of resistance we have now, but we don't have that society right now. So we have people that resist. We have people that counter-organize. We have people that maybe say one thing one day and then really want to sneak away from it the next. How is it that we're going to create kind of approaches in which we can hold people and expect people to resist while we're coming together collectively as a community to create a container? That's very, very challenging. It's hard. And the other two parts are more if you're doing kind of a long-term process, how is it that you are coordinated, you have good communication, you know who's making decisions, you have agreement on that, and how do you move towards closure? So I think that was like a very, very rapid fire move through the different components. We call these our tool, mapping our tools. And these are the different tools. It's hard not to make something somewhat chronological, but there's a way in which these might happen at the same time. Accountability might be happening right at the very beginning. Again, sometimes we have longer processes and they're hard. They're hard to do. Sometimes I know somebody was like, thank God you have an example of one that wasn't really, really long and drawn out. Yes, I was happy to give that as an example as well. So we are, this is 2 hours. So it's long. We're moving to another little part here. And when I was talking with Chal and Sarah about preparing for this, Chal was like, you mean like this story? It was another one like, you mean like this thing that we did the other day? I'm like, yes. In fact, why don't you share, and Chal, if you could just tell the front end of that story, please.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm sharing a story that is something that I was called into recently by a neighbor. So imagine you're driving down the road and you see a woman sitting on the sidewalk facing a building. It's a frat house. You see she's holding up a sign that says, "You raped me." You see that she looks distraught and maybe bloody. You pull over and you approach and ask, "Are you okay?
No,
Can I help
Chal,
you?"
Stop,
Oh,
Chal.
sorry. Yeah.
Just forget that you did those last two parts.
Yeah.
We'll ask, Chal, we'll ask for more later. So I'm sorry to cut you off so violently like that, but it's like, no.
It's okay.
Okay, so just the beginning setup here, and I think many of us can imagine that. Certainly better now that Chal, you described the situation that she ran up to. So there's so many different ways you could deal with that. So what we want to do here is give you a little chance to think. Now this is the Zoom room, the Zoom breakouts, and I am aware, at least I have this response sometimes. I come to a training, I'm like, sitting here and, you might be multitasking, I hope not, but certainly could be. And then there's a breakout room, you're like, oh, no, breakout, freak out. Yes, we are asking you to go into a breakout room. Sarah, do you think three people in a room, or 3 or 4 or 5? What do you think? I'm going to use your wisdom on this.
Yeah, Chell, I think you could do 3, yeah.
3. Okay, so we're just going to give you like 10 minutes to think through. You and you didn't hear the last part of what Chell said. You're driving by, you see this woman distraught in front of a frat house, or you can change the details a little bit if you want. And she has a sign, "You raped me." So what's a response that you could have? And thinking a little bit more about, the kinds of responses we've been talking about. So we're going to give you about, I'm going to say 8 minutes. Can you time it that way, Sarah?
Yep.
Yeah. To talk with your new neighbors about what this brings up, what you might do, and does this have anything to do with this collective responses we've been talking about? Okay. All right. Welcome back, everybody. Thanks for sticking around. I know some people had breakout, freak out, and ran away. I'm just going to say that everybody that's gone now had breakout, freak out. That's why they're gone. But you, the brave and extroversion, stayed on. So this was just like a little experience, just wanted you to have some time to think through things. And probably people had questions like, what is transformative? Just, might have had some other conversations going on, but I'm just going to ask for, if you're willing, I think the chat is great for sharing any insights people had, questions. Some of the things that I think of too is, how do you respond to something that happens on the street versus how would you respond as an agency? I didn't ask this before you broke out, but these are my curiosities. How is it that you could form a collective response that did ask some of the questions and was more open-ended? But if this same person had called your agency, they might have gotten a different response that was less creative and less open. So if anybody wants to share insights or questions or conundrums that came up, I know it's not the greatest way to do this, and I'm sorry, the Zoom, and also just kind of getting near this. Oh, do you need water, food? Really, really basic care needs with things that you're offering, listening and being present. Love that. Relational, not transactional. Beautiful. Okay, very good. What does it look like if you are not of a race and gender that's different? These are really important things to think about. Ask, what do you need? Safety. Okay, great. So I hope that, this was just a way to separating, think about anxieties and worries, separating them. So thank you just for all your thoughtful responses. And of course, there were many of you who had these conversations, and we're not going to be able to benefit from all your insights. But Chell, do you want to say a little bit about what you actually ended up, and you did start going into it, but what you ended up doing, and maybe some insights on how this was helped by your training as, a sexual assault advocate, but also things that might have been different.
Yeah, so I had, forgive me, I had started going into it, but the person who called us in actually did, pull over and, get out of her car and approach this person and ask, are you okay? You know, can I get you something? You know, didn't kind of rapid fire ask these questions, but the questions we're thinking of is, you know, what, like, would you like company while you're here? Would you like me to call someone? Would you like me to call law enforcement? And that was actually the thing that this individual responded to and said, no, I don't want you to call them. You know, and they did say, you know, yes, you can sit with me. So the person who sat with them for a while, called in another community member with their permission to just come and sit there, you know. I was then called in to kind of follow up with what little information we had. You know, this individual did not want to, you know, give up their contact information, and that's okay. You know, my neighbor who called me asked if I could just drive around kind of the next night to see if, you know, anything else happened, if this person was out there again, and if they needed support. But it really, you know, sparked a conversation for us. You know, what if we had, you know, a community run, kind of civilian run crisis team who, you know, in our city, it's a very small city, you know, where we can call on a neighbor to either, you know, come and offer support or ask what somebody needs, what they want, you know, to, you know, help maybe make connections with the local rape crisis program if they do want to talk to an advocate, you know, or a counselor, to offer to, you know, give them a ride to the emergency department if that's something that they want in this crisis situation, if they do need medical care. So that has sparked some conversations in our community, that coupled with a rash of recent fires, you know, where other community networks are just, there are gaps. You know, how do we create, you know, a trauma-informed and survivor-centered crisis team that's not a carceral response, because we realize that not everybody feels comfortable in that space or is safe to do that. So, yeah.
Thank you, Chal. So that just, you know, this is a pathway on like the idea of like a civilian response team. Different communities are coming up with different ideas about what we can do. I think the thing is, sometimes we're doing that because we don't want to call the rape crisis center because we know what they're going to say. And it's not going to be responsive. You know, I'm just going to say that, you know, you're all representing different rape crisis centers, but these are questions that, you know, also the story I gave, would you have supported that? Would you have felt ready to? How can you get yourself ready to support something like that? So I'm going to move on. 2 hours goes by fast. I have this whole other part. I have 2 more parts. All right. We still have a little bit of traveling to do, y'all. So take a deep breath. I was really wondering if I was going to include this again. I'm just going to a little bit map out a little restorative justice, transformative justice thing here. So if we look at this grid, because I'm looking more like what are some of the programmatic responses we talk about. If we look at kind of one is involves the criminal justice system, on the other end is community alternatives. If we look at not really caring about the person who caused harm, or, you know, looking at a punishment, carceral response, and more high interest in positive engagement. These are just, you could have done this different ways, but this is how I put this one together. So if you put them together, then we're thinking about the current criminal legal system, some people call it retributive, transformative justice world. And, you know, I have some of that chipped a little bit in the lower interest in positive engagement, because that's just true among some people. You know, if we're actually going to look at it, it's like we're like transformative justice is a tiny dot, and then this current criminal justice approach would be probably going to the Hollywood sign from where I am now. It's huge. You know, I can't really do that justice in terms of proportion here on the Zoom. But just want to look a little bit more at transformative justice. For some people, they consider community accountability and transformative justice pretty much, you know, words that mean relatively the same thing. Some people, if you look at Marian Kaba's work and Shira Hassan's work in fumbling, they definitely think of community accountability as a transformative justice as an overarching framework. Community accountability as being the kinds of processes or sort of practices is used to encounter harm, abuse, violence. So kind of a subsector of that. Some people talk about, I hear sometimes people say somebody had a rapid response and it was a collective response. And they go, I don't think that was transformative justice, that was community accountability. I don't know if anybody has said that yourself or heard, but I just want to share with you some of the different ways that people are talking about this. Like if something was a rapid response and didn't look like, you know, it was like more of a takedown or of the person who caused harm and didn't look like it was interested in any kind of compassion, connection, transformation. Sometimes people say, well, is that transformative justice? I think this is an ongoing debate in our movement. So I'm just going to put them together for the purposes of this, going through this. I just want to basically look at also restorative justice. And a lot of people are asking what the difference is. I'm going to say this so quickly, it's not giving it justice at all. But restorative justice, generally it has a different historical trajectory. So those of us who have been in transformative justice, even though some people are familiar with restorative justice and kind of came in through that door, most of us came in through a very much social justice door, INCITE, critical resistance, and so on. Things that have led us towards abolition, even if we didn't call ourselves abolitionists or think of it as abolition at that time, certainly anti-carceral. So restorative justice tends to be through more systems-based kinds of approaches, oftentimes tied to law enforcement. So you're going to see a big rise in like restorative justice is that we have to use restorative justice. What do they mean by restorative justice? I'm not saying it's necessarily bad. I'm involved in a project right now. But so many times it is involved in the police are driving it, the DAs have started it, they're determining who gets to be in it, somebody has to be arrested first. So I am cautioning you about adopting a form of RJ or restorative justice that is tied to law enforcement. How is that then moving away? It's just like a little patchwork, a little reform on a harmful system. Can we have restorative justice methods that are completely separated from the police? That is something that I'm working on right now. It tends to be more professionalized, like that's just a goal and it's an assumption. There's the idea that you're restoring to something that was initially good, where I think people who are gravitating towards transformative justice, we're not returning to something necessarily foundationally good. These harms have come out of conditions of oppression, that people have come out of communities that have been embedded in harm, systems of harm. So it's transformative justice tends to be grassroots political work, talking about conditions needing to be transformed, more of a framework and so on, and definitely not tied to law enforcement. So I'm not one that's usually dogmatic about language, but if it is tied to law enforcement, it is not transformative justice, and please do not use that language. I just want to say that there are some programs that have been in the restorative justice world, and there's one like with the San Francisco Sheriff's Department. So obviously that's pretty carceral, and it works with people that are already in jail. There's a Circles of Peace that's in Nogales, Arizona, that's started by a judge, and it works with people who have been arrested for domestic violence. Hollow Water, some of you may be familiar with that. It's a program up, particularly working with sexual violence up in a First Nations community in Canada. Impact Justice is its organization that Sujata Baliga was very much tied in with, if you are familiar with her, and has used restorative justice kind of circles in order to deal with domestic and sexual violence and other forms of harm. And I say that there is a movement among at least some people that have been like more explicitly tied to restorative justice, who are really looking at, wow, maybe we've relied too much on the police. Let's move towards non-police responses. So I just want to say that there is that movement there, but it's not that strong. It's just among a few people. How about transformative justice and community accountability? We have CARA, some of you are familiar with them, from Seattle, right around like, they started in 1999. The Northwest Network in Seattle still does great work. Generation 5 is no longer an organization, but they were in the Bay Area, very, very essential to addressing, coming up with really raising and elevating the term transformative justice. They have a great manual or handbook that's available online. Some that came out like more in the mid 2000s was Creative Interventions, my organization, or our organization, Philly Stands Up, Support New York. All of these, they all, even if the organizations aren't there anymore, they all have left websites and tools for people to use. And even more recently is Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective, Mia Minga started, Project Nia, which Mariam Kaba started, Just Practice, Shira Hassan and others. Spring Up is a newer one based in Denver now that works a lot with college campuses. And I think some of you already saw Stas and Lee and have signed up for to be part of a cohort. They do excellent work. So just really, you'll get so much out of that. So there's some crossover. They're not solely apart, but I just want to raise the distinctions to make you aware of something that's like, oh, yay, restorative justice. Look at it more carefully. Look to see who is actually running that show. Who has control over that? Is this another carceral creep? I want to put a couple programs because we're looking at actual programmatic responses. There's not a lot right now. And if you have one, please let me know. API Chaya, I know Kiyomi, I don't know if Kiyomi is still on right now, but Kiyomi was definitely one of the key people that was part of API Chaya in Seattle that has started a program where with certain sexual violence cases that they think that a transformative justice approach is aligned with and where the people want that, then they have been doing a little experiment to see if some of those cases can be brought outside of the usual way that they do programmatic responses and whether that can be done in this more collective kind of way. So that really, really proud of the work that API Chaya has been doing and maybe to consider having them and talk to your audience more about what they've been doing and what they've learned from that. I'm part of something called, we're trying to come up with a better name. If you have good names, please come up with a word circle. Community Restorative Justice Solutions, terrible name, but very interesting program. We are trying to use the restorative circle processes, but without law enforcement. And we have 9 provider organizations that are part of our collaborative, and we're trying to see how we can actually bring kind of these more systematic circle processes, people that want to have what we say difficult conversations around violence that has happened and is happening in their families and their communities. So we've been doing that for a couple of years, and we're continuing to do that work. And definitely once we feel like we have enough to share, we're going to share publicly. It's been pretty much under the radar right now because we're so starting experimental, but we're starting to kind of emerge more publicly. I see if you can give me 2 minutes, I'm coming to a close here. And I know a lot of you were like, what can we do? First, I don't know, if you can think, we all have to change, right? We have been just in the soup of carceral responses to violence. We have been part of pushing them. We have been co-opted by law enforcement. We have been partners. We need to change. We need to change our cultures, our practices, our policies. Sometimes we need to change who we're hiring. I want to look at this as options both for building your internal capacity to do transformative justice work. I know this is really quick and I'm so sorry, I'm going to go a little bit over. But how is it that you can do experiments like API Chai? I know I didn't say much about it, but could you carve out a part of what you do and say, could we try this? Maybe we're not ready to change our whole organization or service delivery model, but can we actually support an experiment and just see how it works and how it works within our organization? Can we get a team of people to do this together and to help support each other? How do we build that? And then can that lead to some more systematic implementation of at least program components that move in this kind of collective, supportive, facilitating sort of response, or maybe the civilian teams that Chell was talking about? How do we sustain that? So we can think about how do we have internal capacity to actually offer these types of options that we don't have right now, or maybe you kind of have them and you're going to build them. Then on the other hand, how is it that you, and I see this because honestly, I've seen so little change in the last 5 years or so when there's been more of a demand for people to talk about this. If you are not able to do that, or you're in that no, never 15%, what is it that you can offer to people who are the civilian teams, if you want to call it, the mutual aid, the grassroots transformative justice collectives? How can you offer support to people who are doing defund the police and invest in community care? How do you give support to people you don't always see as your survivors, people that are incarcerated, people involved in sex workers, sex trades? These are people that we as a movement have not served. So how is it that we can make that pivot and really ask ourselves the hard questions? What role can we take? How can we share what we do have, which is we do have knowledge about sexual assault. We have people that are in our programs right now, but we also have many, many, many volunteers who have left who could be mobilized to work in some of these experiment, be part of civilian groups, be part of grassroots groups. How can we think creatively to offer resources, space, trainings, support, asking people who are doing that kind of work what they need from you? And rather than saying, oh, we can't actually change the entire organization, so we're going to do nothing. So that is my my call out for you to think about yourself as part of this ecosystem. How are you going to network and strategize with other people? You each have a different role. You each have a different expertise. You have a different role to play. But also, how can you work to organize? It says don't panic, but also don't side with big fish, y'all. How do you organize and work for people who are most vulnerable and our most impacted communities? And with that, I'm going to end. Thank you so much for sitting with me an extra 4 minutes. And really, really appreciate having this time with you. I hope that was helpful in moving forward in your, if not in your agencies, then in your personal lives, in your political lives, in your community lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mimi. And thank you all for joining us. We'll be sending out all the resources in the chat and the recording. And thank you so much, Chal, for being our Zoom tech person. So thank you all.
Absolutely. And storyteller. Okay.
Yes.
Wishing you all the best. Thank you so much for having me here with you today.
Take care.
Thank you, Mimi.
Hi, Mimi, I'm just going to save the chat. You wanted to see the chat as well, right?
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'll send that along to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you so
Bye,
much.
Bye,
Take
Chella.
care.
Bye.
Bye. See ya, Chal. Thank you.
I have
Bye.
I have a list of resources.
Oh, cool.
I kept track of some of the things in the chat. So I will share that with you.
Yes, thank you. I was just going to tell you to put that together. All right. I know
Oh,
you're
perfect.
bouncing off to stuff. Take
Yes,
care,
I will
ciao.
talk to you later.
Yeah, bye.